For those of you who are visiting this morning, maybe wondering where our kids are. On the first Sunday of the month, they begin in the chapel across the street, and then they go into Sunday school. The rest of the month, they're in here for a children's moment, the beginning of worship, and then they go across the street. But that's why you didn't see them. Another thing, you may notice that we're singing sort of some favorite hymns. We've been doing that for the last several weeks, and we'll continue to do that for a little while longer. We took a poll earlier this summer to find out what everybody likes, so we are going through and singing those favorite hymns. And today I continue with my summer sermon series on superpowers. So say that 5 times fast. And today the superpower that I'm going to talk about is creativity. So I thought about, what is the most creative joke that I could find out there? So I looked around and I found this one. What did the old man say to his grandson before he kicked the bucket? How far do you think I can kick this bucket? Well, that was pretty good. Probably not the most creative joke ever. So let's talk about creativity. One of the big misconceptions about creativity is that some people are more creative than others. And we think this because we tend to associate creativity with art, the ability to make art. So artists, in other words, are more creative than the rest of us. But this is not necessarily the case. A person can be creative in a variety of ways. For example, I think one of the most creative people who ever lived was Steve Jobs, who's the founder and CEO, the late Steve Jobs of Apple. And Jobs said, creativity is just connecting things. Creativity is just connecting things. Of course, the iPhone is a good example of this. It's a technological marvel that connects various different types of technology all into one device. So it's just, he's bringing all this technology together to make connections. So that's one way to be creative. Another good insight into creativity for the masses is a comment made by a Chinese video game designer named Genova Chen, who said, creativity is not talent, but attitude. It's not necessarily talent, but attitude. And we can all have an attitude, can we not? Not just a creative attitude, but a good or a bad attitude. But we can all do that. So we can be creative in a multitude of ways, whether it be technology, maybe you write songs or poetry, or you cook, or you can fix cars, or you garden, or scrapbook, and just go on down the line. Whatever you are passionate about, there is room for creativity in that, whatever your passion is. So there is a downside to not being a creative person. In the book that I've been using for this series, called Hope and Other Superpowers by John Pavlovitz, he says that when we are not being creative, we become spiritually dehydrated. Spiritually dehydrated. And so he says creativity is what rehydrates people. Have you ever felt spiritually dehydrated? Of course you have. We all have. You lose the light inside of you. You feel low on life in general. No passion about anything. The world looks bleak. Your cup of despair runneth over. You lose the desire to create anything, even the desire to be playful, to play. You lose all that. You abandon anything that gives your life meaning. And so if you're a painter, you stop painting, or you stop writing, listening to music, exercising, eating right, meditating, whatever it is you might do. When you're spiritually dehydrated, you stop doing those things. So it's a very dark place to be. And we've all been there. And I don't know how to give really good advice. You know, I'm not a self-help guru or anything like that on how to combat this. But I do think the Apostle Paul in his letter to the Colossians was really onto something when he said this. This is a little phrase that I've kind of focused on for many years. He says, set your minds on things that are above. Set your minds on things that are above. And I've wrestled with that verse for a long time, trying to understand what does he really mean by that? How can that apply to you and me? And for a long time I thought it was sort of a reference to what we would call meditation. Because meditation is a great way to set our minds on something else, or on things that are above, metaphorically speaking. But have you ever tried to tell your mind what to do? Try setting your mind on something for more than 10 seconds and see what happens. It will wander off like an undisciplined puppy looking for a rug to pee on. It really will. Try to still your mind for a few seconds, and it will eventually start acting like a Mexican jumping bean, or a bag of Jiffy popcorn. Just pop, pop, pop all over the place. Try to empty your mind for a few moments, and it will torment you with a constant flow of unconnected thoughts. I don't know about you, but in my experience, meditation consists of telling my mind to shut up every few seconds so that I can get back to meditating. So, setting our minds on things that are above has to be more than just getting into a lotus position and telling the hummingbirds in our brain to go away. In fact, I think it's sort of the opposite. Setting our minds on things that are above is really about actively pursuing and cultivating a creative vision. Using your mind to create, to imagine. Now there's no question that occasionally we need to stop and smell the roses. We need to take a break, both in body and mind, and do our best to rest, even just for a moment. But setting our minds on things that are above is really the opposite. It is to put our minds into overdrive. I'm sure many of you remember the Superman comic, or the movies where Clark Kent ducks into a phone booth, and he unrobes, so to speak, and he comes out as Superman, right? And he takes off. Well, setting our minds on things that are above is like taking our minds into the proverbial phone booth, like Clark Kent, stripping off all that which is covering or limiting the imaginative and creative powers of our minds, and emerging from that phone booth in a mental superhero costume, cape and all, ready to fly away to do great things. One of Superman's great superpowers was X-ray vision. Remember that? He could see through most things. Well, likewise, setting our minds on things that are above is like seeing through the world and having a creative vision of the world. You may have noticed at the beginning of worship, in our call to worship, there were a lot of crazy allusions to these superheroes. I'm sure most of you have not heard of most of them, right? I had to do a lot of research to find them. I was Googling time-traveling superheroes, and that's what I came up with. But like a time-traveling superhero, setting our minds on things that are above means seeing or envisioning what the world could be like. What can the world be like in the future? So we're like time travelers in that sense. Now, a few sentences later, after Paul makes that statement, he tells his readers to put to death those things that are earthly. So first he tells us to put our minds on things that are above, and then he says, put to death those things that are earthly. And so like Clark Kent in a phone booth, he is telling us to step into that booth and strip off the old self and clothe ourselves, he says, with a new self. And when we pop out of that metaphorical phone booth with a new self, he says, we will no longer see the world in the way that we've always seen the world, as Greek and Jew. And so he goes in this list of enemies, so to speak. Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave and free. Instead, he says, we will see a world where Christ is all and in all. That is a world where everyone is connected and the distinctions don't matter. So it's all about having a creative imagination or vision for a new world. We may not have the ability to draw pictures or play guitar, but we do have the ability, all of us do, to imagine a new world, and more importantly, to make that world happen. That is a God-given superpower that we have been given, and we should pursue and try to cultivate in our lives. Now, one caveat here. This creative vision of a new world does not mean that we become so idealistic and so pie in the sky that we lose touch with reality. Spiritually speaking, we might want to be like Superman, but we are also like Clark Kent. We live in the real world. As someone said, we have to be able to imagine a world that we've never known, to have that creative vision, while acknowledging the one that does exist. So we're a people of two worlds, the world that exists, the world that we want. I'm going to give you two examples of the world as it exists in contrast to the world that we want. The first example, we woke up this morning to hear news about yet another mass shooting. So it's been a week of at least 4 that I know of, mass shootings just in our country, from California to Mississippi to Texas, and last night, Ohio. And of course, like you, I've thought about this a lot over the years, trying to understand, why does this keep happening? Why do we keep repeating ourselves? And of course, there's the usual suspects to blame. And I do lay blame on the usual suspects. There is easy access to weapons of mass destruction. That's exactly what they are. There are mental health issues that we don't grapple with fully. There are people who have become radicalized in their ideologies, like white supremacy or whatever. And all of that is true. But I think there's something else that we're not talking about. Not long ago, I read a book about Columbine. And that's the school shooting that seemingly started all this madness a little over 20 years ago. And the two young men involved in that shooting, they were certainly creative in the sense of making bombs and designing a plan to carry out, even though they largely failed in the sense they didn't kill as many people as they wanted to kill. But the one thing that comes through loud and clear when I read that book is that these two young men were spiritually dehydrated. They were setting their minds on earthly things rather than things that are above. The only world they could imagine was dark and deadly, and so they tried to blow it up. And the same thing keeps happening almost on a daily basis, over and over again, and we seem powerless to stop it. And I think this is why the world needs creative followers of Christ, people who can imagine a world that we really have never known, even as we try to acknowledge the one that does exist. And again, this is the gift of Christ to the world. Christ offers us living water so that we can be spiritually rehydrated, and then we are sent out to carry that water to others. When I was a freshman in high school, I volunteered to be the manager for the high school football team. I was not able to play football because I had a spiritual disability caused by an injury. But it was a small school, and everybody, needed to contribute. So I thought, well, one thing I can do, I can be the manager. But unbeknownst to me, the manager position was not what I thought it was, because it was really nothing more than being a water boy. And I only volunteered to be the water boy or the manager for 1 year because I did not like being a water boy. It felt degrading. It felt like a complete waste of time. But now, I want to be a water boy. Specifically, I want to be Christ's water boy, doing my part to bring living water to a spiritually dehydrated, uncreative, unimaginative world. Here's another illustration of what I'm talking about. This week, in fact, on Friday, is the 5th anniversary of the Mike Brown shooting and the beginning of the Ferguson uprising. Now, as you know, I came here after all that happened. But what I saw and what I continue to see is a thirst. It's a thirst and a desire to create a better community and, by extension, a better world. And so, if you notice all the artwork that's on the sides of the streets in Ferguson, the roadside paintings that we see all around town that sprang up, I assume, in response to that event, these are signs that what Ferguson needs and wants, and what the world needs and wants, are more artists. More artists. And not just artists who work on canvas, but people who have a creative vision of the world. A world where distinctions between people are celebrated rather than disparaged. A world where, to paraphrase the Apostle Paul, there's no Greek or Jew, there's no black and white, gay and straight, male and female, immigrant and citizen, slave and free, rich and poor, and I could go on and on. In other words, a creative vision that sees the world as God sees the world, not as we see it now, but as God sees the world from above. So let us walk into that metaphorical phone booth and strip off the old self. And let us clothe ourselves with a new self, which is being renewed according to the image, the imagination of our Creator. Let us rehydrate ourselves by setting our minds on things that are above. and watch as we soar as if we are on eagle's wings. Amen.